Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Frederick Winsness, and I want to welcome you all to this webinar. There are still a few people that are struggling a little bit with the audio, but we're trying to help them out. But we're going to get underway at this point. I want to welcome everyone to yet another NetHope Solutions Center webinar, but this one is a little bit different. Today we're going to be hearing from the No Lost Generation Consortium and what to expect from them in 2018. Very excited to welcome that group and UNICEF, Mercy Corps on World Vision, and NetHope representation as well. Before we get underway, I just want to go over a little bit of housekeeping. We do want to make this as interactive as possible, so do line up your questions in the chat window. I'd recommend you open the chat window in WebEx right away and follow the communication that's going on there. And as the presenters get underway, please place your questions there, and we'll take a facilitated Q&A session towards the end of the hour today. We'll also be recording this session, or we are recording this session, and we'll be sending out an email to all of you and all people that are not able to make it but RSVP to this session with a link to the recording and the presentations that will be posted to the Solution Center and the webinar page we have there. And at the very end, I'll come back and ask people to answer a short little online survey. We just want to get feedback for the session to give provide feedback to the presenters and your ideas in terms of how we can make this series of webinars better as we go on. So without any further ado, I want to introduce Katie Barnett. She is with UNICEF and the No Lost Generation Advisor. She's based in both in the Middle East and responsible for activities there in the Middle East and in North Africa. So Katie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Frederick. So I'd really like to welcome everybody. It's a fantastic turnout, and in a way it doesn't surprise me because well, from what I've seen of No Lost Generation, and I've been the coordinator of the initiative for 2 years now, it really is a very compelling call to action, and it has attracted a lot of interest from the humanitarian donor community and from the private sector and even from publics and students and activists and all kinds of people who are interested in supporting children and young people affected by the conflicts in Syria and Iraq. Although I am employed by UNICEF, my role is to be a neutral coordinator and facilitator of the whole initiative, and UNICEF is very lucky to be joined in leading the initiative by 3 co-leads. So you can see that we have Mercy Corps and World Vision here. Our 3rd co-lead is Save the Children. So I just wanted to mention that because their logo wasn't on the webinar at the beginning because they're not actually presenting today, but on behalf of them as well, I want to welcome you. As you can see, we have 2 regionally based people presenting. The first is Amy Wells, who has a technical role as an adolescent and youth advisor in the Middle East and is on the day-to-day level, the co-lead that I work with in Mercy Corps. And the second is Mark Chappell, also has a technical role within his organization, World Vision, where he leads on regional education. And our final presenter is Layla Toklik, who is based in the US, actually on the West Coast, and has been a great supporter of No Lost Generation for the last year and a bit because she has a particular role in running a tech task force that has been set up to support the work that we're doing here on the ground by channeling and facilitating collaboration with the private sector and mostly with the tech sector. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to those speakers. We'll start off with Mark, who'll give an introduction of No Lost Generation more generally, and that's the bit where some of you might have heard of No Lost Generation but kind of think, who is that? You know, what does it cover and what does it not cover? He will cover that. Then Amy will talk to us about plans for 2018 very specifically. and then we'll turn to Leila for more of the exciting work that's that she'll give an overview of, which we're doing in collaboration with the private sector. So I'm handing back to Mark.
Okay, thank you, Katie, for that introduction, and welcome everyone. Great to see so many people interested in the Next Generation Initiative. As with Katie, I've been working on the Next Generation Initiative for a couple of years, and I'm going to take a bit of time to explain the initiative, the multi-agency approach, the collaborative nature, and some of the achievements and added value over the last couple of years, before handing over to Amy, who's going to present the work going forward, what we plan to do and what you can expect from this year and in the future. So, really, Next Generation was established very early in the crisis, back in 2013, to help focus attention on three sectors, three areas, which are traditionally underserved in humanitarian crisis. So they never really received the level of funding that we asked for in appeals, but they are critical to long-term stability and to the future of countries, and in this case, the region, when they're affected by conflict and crises. So it was relatively successful in drawing attention to these three areas: education, protection, and adolescence and youth engagement. These are what we now call the three pillars of Next Generation. And relative to other crises, we've managed to draw in considerably higher proportion of funding and attention to these areas, and able to generate attention both with the host communities, the host governments in the region, and in donor governments much further afield. Next Generation covers the 6 countries affected by the Syria crisis, so Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. And one of the critical things to note about Next Generation is that it doesn't set additional indicators or outcomes or expectations upon implementing partners, but it is embedded instead in the response plans for the countries. So the 3RP for the surrounding countries of Syria, the HRP for Syria, and the HRP for Iraq. They set out the programmatic interventions that are to be done under these three pillars. One of the exciting things for the Next Generation Initiative is the partnership approach. As Katie mentioned, there are 4 co-leads: UNICEF, World Vision, Mercy Corps, and Save the Children, and around 30 active members at a regional level. These come together for the regional working group and help support and steer the work of the Next Generation Initiative. In terms of implementation, there's around 100 active partners across the region implementing programs that we would call Next Generation programs. So some of the added value of Next Generation, as well as being a real partnership together and an opportunity for NGOs and bodies to collaborate at a regional level, where we don't have other regional fora, to bring people together for coordination and collaboration. It really functions in terms of opportunity to mobilize resources for these sectors, as in drawing funding and drawing attention and support for these areas. It helps provide an overarching framework for key areas. So as opposed to telling us what to do, it does help support how we approach these sectors. So it does give some framework for the way of implementing and delivering programs. It provides a platform for joint advocacy, which I'll come to a little later, allowing us to highlight the priorities for children and youth. And a key part of that is actually amplifying the voices of adolescents and youth themselves, making sure they have a space in front of key decision makers who are making a lot of the decisions and strategic choices around the response to the humanitarian crisis. And another key added value has been the linking across the sectors. As I mentioned, there's no real regional fora for education and child protection in particular, and certainly not for bringing together these three pillars. So the working group allows these pillars to come together and look at some cross-sector issues which are quite difficult to address under one pillar or one sector alone, such as child labour, early marriage, early childhood care and development, psychosocial support. How does this regional activity, this working group, link to the country level work? So there's the working group that meets. There's a graphic now up on the slide. It's a little bit small, but hopefully you can see an overall structure. The working group is co-led by UNICEF and World Vision. Within the working group, advocacy is co-led by Save the Children and knowledge management by UNICEF. The three technical focal points, or the technical focal points are there for each pillar: education, protection, adolescence and youth. And these technical focal points cascade the information from the working group down to coordination mechanisms in the countries. So the clusters, the working groups for each sector in the countries, and also bring information up. So they report back every working group meeting with updates from the countries, updates from the cluster, updates from the sectors. And then the coordination mechanisms in country, the clusters and working groups, they link directly with their members. Alongside this, we have bilateral coordination within organizations who also share information on neural stimulation to their country counterparts across the region. And increasingly, on the mailing list, we also have a number of agencies from other areas across the world who are interested in the work and the approaches being done in the Syria crisis. Later is going to talk about the Tech Task Force, which operates virtually, and it links the working group with global private sector initiatives. You'll hear more about that later. Donor engagement, a big part of our work is outreach to donors. We do that through some formal donor meetings that we set up with donors, briefings that we hand out on specific subjects. We set up and run bilateral meetings with the co-leads. We speak very much at conferences and do ongoing donor outreach in terms of sharing information and updates. And this is really to ensure that we retain the focus on these three sectors in any kind of global fora, regional fora. For example, the Brussels conference that's coming up in a couple of weeks, the pledging conference, we are pushing very hard as a group to make sure education, protection, youth engagement stay on the agenda, and that young people themselves have a voice in that conference. As an example here are some of the donors that are funding neural stimulation programs. Cross-sector collaboration, as mentioned earlier, through the working group, we've developed an interagency intersector child labour strategic framework. We've established a regional coordination mechanism for early childhood care and development, and under psychosocial support, we have run a conference and shared a number of pieces of research from the region with partners to try and move the conversation forward on an evidence-based basis. Another piece of work we've been doing under neural stimulation is setting up and running a series of events to highlight some initiatives, innovation, good practice, and evidence-based programming. Within those, we had the EdTech Summit last year, over 200 people coming together to look at education can use technology to better reach and support the needs of affected children and young people across the region. We ran an early childhood care and development event last summer, bringing together experts, and one of the outcomes of that was a coordination mechanism and some funding for that. Following up the EdTech Summit, we did a Silicon Valley Symposium out in San Francisco, again working very closely with tech companies to highlight some issues faced by youth and help them develop some solutions to the challenges, which later we'll talk a little bit about later. We ran a PSS, Positive Pathways Symposium, last year in Oman as well, bringing together some of the latest learning and thinking around psychosocial support. And just last month we did a Tech Summit in Oman again, a follow-up Tech Summit, really to continue the conversation with private sector companies, with tech companies, about how to support the crisis. So we've had some really good feedback and opportunities to move the conversation forward thanks to these events. And they've really been a collaborative process with a number of next generation partners involved. In terms of advocacy, we coordinate that around key moments like the Housekeeping conference, the London conference, the upcoming Brussels conference, the UN General Assembly, the World Humanitarian Summit, as well as some specific events we set up on the last generation, like an advocacy event in Congress in Washington. We produce products to increase attention and give visibility for issues across the 3 pillars. We maintain a cohort of influential NLG champions, both those within the sectors, so some leaders of our respective agencies, but also celebrities from across the acting and sporting world as well. And the representation of children, adolescents and youth is very critical, where we have the voice of children and people themselves at the World Humanitarian Summit, at the Pledging Conference, and in the next couple of weeks at Brussels as well, actually speaking to decision makers saying, these are the issues we're facing, this is why we need your support, this is why we need your continued support for the next generation. Sorry. And then in terms of knowledge management, we have expanded the reach and accessibility of resources and lessons learned, which will be on the website, which is being relaunched next week. There's a resource repository and library on there. We circulate the website and newsletter and regular update reports. We disseminate quality cross-sector and cross-agency content and demonstrate the collaboration and engagement that's going on, and continue to build a shared evidence base for people with good practice to move forward. In response to Frederick's question in the chat, for agencies to join NLG, to join the working group, you have to be an agency working across at least 3 of the countries on at least one of the pillars. But to sign up for the Next Generation newsletters, any agency can do that. So we'll put a link in the chat box a little later to make sure everyone can do that if they want to, and if they're not already signed up. And also Frederick's other question, other NLG initiatives in other parts of the world, not specifically, no. We'll come to that at the end and answer questions at the end of the presentation. So now that's a really summary of what we've done so far with the Next Generation, the added value, the fact that we've worked really hard as a coalition, supporting each other as agencies to really help support the children and youth affected by crises across the region. And what are we going to do now? I'll hand over to my colleague Amy to take us forward on this. Over to you, Amy.
Hello, everybody. Good morning to some, good afternoon, good evening. The beauty of being all across the world. Mark kind of gave you a sense of what NLG is, and I'm here to kind of tell you what we're going to do in the coming year. Can everybody hear me okay? You're alive out there and listening? I wish I could see not
head. No problem. Okay. We can hear you just fine.
Great.
I also can hear you.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the NLG Work Plan for 2018. It's actually the first time as an initiative that we've put together a structured work plan. I think it's a sign of our growing up in a sense. The work plan is set in place to support strategic thinking, accountability, and truly, it says, but ambitious goals. We're really trying to work together and bring all of these different partners and agencies together to meet the needs of this generation. It also includes key and performance indicators, and it was a very consultative process with all of the different partners that are part of the No Less Generation initiative. So some of the main objectives, obviously reiterating things that Mark said, they're going to show up again here. Our objectives are advocacy. We'll continue to advocate for children and youth across NLG countries to influence decision makers, and some of the examples that he gave you previously are ways in which we'll do so. I'll go into it more. Fundraising and accountability is an important part of what we do. So as NLG, the funding level for programs under the pillars in each of the 6 NLG countries is at least 60% of the humanitarian appeal target. So we're advocating to maintain these commitments. Knowledge management is a huge part of what we do. As someone asked, how do you join, how do you engage with NLG? An important part about that engagement is making sure that we have and share knowledge across the country teams at the regional level through events, products, etc. And then this one we kind of didn't talk about as much before, but this is a huge part of who we are and what we're doing and more intentionally focused on in the coming year, which is ensuring the voices of children and youth are heard at all levels. So kind of across advocacy, across knowledge management, making sure that we're elevating that youth voice intentionally and in a big way. So those are our working group objectives. The slide, there we go. Under advocacy, as you'll remember, Mark talked about there being 3 pillars that the No Less generation focuses on. And, when you look at a child or a young person, you recognize that education alone, it needs to work with child protection. We need to have a focus on adolescents and youth. So our advocacy goes across these 3 pillars. So under pillar 1, which you can see is education, our job here is, again, to make donors or hold donors and host countries accountable to their commitments, to their investments made at London and Brussels. We're advocating for refugee and vulnerable host community children access to quality education. It's really important here that this is a holistic approach. We're looking at refugee and vulnerable host communities. We're increasing access of out-of-school children inside Syria. That the community, the international community, continues or prioritizes education in Iraq. And this particular pledge in 2016 of 1.4 billion a year. So again, ensuring accountability to those numbers that were put out, because it's important to make them happen. Just because they were said doesn't mean that they're going to take them up and continue. So for our child protection, again, this is our 2nd pillar. It's a huge issue facing children and young people across the region. I think education is something that we're familiar with. It's visible, it's really important, and sometimes child protection we have to continue to elevate. So our role as NLG is to raise awareness against violations, and including grave violations of children's rights, ensure children that are deemed associated with armed groups have full access to their rights. This is a huge issue in our region and probably globally, but particularly in this region. And ensure that discussions about solutions actually take into account the issues that children and youth are facing. A lot of times we don't incorporate youth voice or listen to their experiences and incorporate their voice and role into the decisions that are made at the funding level, at the program level, and it's our job to elevate that. Adolescents and youth, as you can tell, my title is the Adolescents and Youth Advisor, so you can't overlove one pillar more than the other, but this is certainly the space that I spend a lot of my time and energy. So our advocacy role for adolescents and youth, again, is to make sure that they have meaningful and systematic ways to participate. Young people are frequently left out of decision making. They're seen as victims, or they are seen as threats, so they're not engaged in the process. That we change the narrative from this victim threat to positive change agents, that our messaging, our way, and our approach is to elevate their presence and approach. And that it also takes into account and addresses the economic constraints of youth and the particular time of their life that they're in, and the youth unemployment issues in the region. So when I go to, I see your question. I'll make sure that we incorporate this in the questions as we go. As the Mercy Corps, the knowledge management lead, so Mark already mentioned some of our knowledge management priorities that we're working on. You will have an updated No Last Generation website very soon, which is a big priority for 2018 to facilitate our collaboration, knowledge sharing. There's an online knowledge repository. What makes this interesting is that there's certainly education resources, child protection, and adolescent needs resources that are not brought together in one place. So we're aiming to try to make it easier for partners and programs to access content. Series of 6 to 8 webinars, of which you are experiencing. The quarterly No Less Generation newsletter, which features stories from different partners across the partnership, and resources, evidence, and learning from relevant global level events and used at the community level, and then an adolescence and youth online observatory. So our knowledge management tools are, we're building a lot of these things as we go forward. As part of our planning for 2018, the partners sat down and looked at, given that we are looking at cross-cutting issues and the context in NLG countries is significantly shifting and changing, the thematic priorities that we want to focus on through different events and content, et cetera, are these different issues that you see here. So looking at the issue of legal identity and civil documentation, this continues to plague all of the young people that we're working with, the conflict situations and environments. Access to learning opportunities, you'll see learning, this includes formal, non-formal learning opportunities for children and youth. The issues of child labor and child marriage continue. The child marriage rates have spiked and continue to increase. There's a lot of work around child labor at the regional level. Family tracing and reunification. Violence affecting male and female children, adolescents, and youth. Violence, there's been some very interesting violence reports and an increase in violence both for male and female children and youth across the region, and recognizing that this is an issue that we're all facing in our programming. Engagement and participation for young people. And then early childhood care and development. These are the thematic priorities that we want to elevate through NLG. The last thing I'll kind of show you is our NLG calendar for 2018. So what does it look like for the coming months? I was going to say, oh, I'll not read it all to you, but I want to make sure that I give you a quick snapshot here. But you can see that it's a mix of our donor briefings, our events, and the various content that we're releasing across and throughout the year. We had the NLG Tech Summit in February. We had in January the NLG donor briefing. March, NLG consultation, education consultation. April, NLG education report and evidence brief on adolescence. This is an advocacy moment to elevate these issues at the Brussels conference. May, we'll have another donor briefing. June, another event, thematic event on child labor linked to our thematic priorities. July, NLG Tech Task Force webinar, so another one in August. NLG Evidence Symposium on Adolescents and Youth. We did this last year and we will do it again this year. This, brings together young people from across the region. October, we potentially will have an event focusing on child marriage. We had last year NLG psychosocial support events, and then December another webinar. So it's a mix of our different ways of reaching both communities that are in person and in the region, and then outside of the region through multiple different channels. So that is our plan for 2018. There's tons of questions. So I think I meant to hand over to Layla. Do we want to hold the questions until the end?
That's correct. So yeah, we'll facilitate questions to the end. Go ahead,
Great. Thank you so much, Amy, for this overview. So good morning, everybody from San Francisco. I have about just 10 minutes to share with you the work that we've been doing with the NLG Tech Task Force, and then we'll make sure to get to as many of your questions as possible, so feel free to continue adding them to the chat window. So as Katie, Mark, and Amy mentioned over the past, 30 minutes, reaching conflict-affected children and youth with the support they need is quite a complex and also long-term work. It does require a collaborative and cross-sector approach, and also some of the innovative solutions that can help us deliver at scale and also long-term impact. And private sector in this case brings a unique combination of both expertise and resources that are critical for helping us, the humanitarian community, support both the urgent and ongoing needs of children and youth affected by the refugee crisis. And among those resources are our technology products and services. And that's exactly what I will talk about over the next 10 minutes, how we're engaging private sector and evaluating what role technology, tools, and services can play in helping us meet the needs while enabling scale and increasing quality. So for those of you who are new to the NLG Tech Task Force, here's just a brief introduction. In March of last year, so 2017, about 13 months ago, the No Lost Generation Initiative and NetHope, NetHope is a tech consortium of 53 global NGOs, many of them represented also as part of NLG. So NLG and NetHope came together and with the support from Microsoft, set up the No Lost Generation Tech Task Force. Really with the goal to bring humanitarian development experts together with the private sector to identify some of the highest impact opportunities to address what Amy and Mark talked about: education, livelihoods, participation, and protection needs of conflict-affected children and youth, ultimately to help us really ensure that there is no lost generation. And then since last March, the task force has actually grown to over 70 global members, including those that you're seeing on, whose logos you're seeing on this slide. And they're truly global, both from the region as well as from other parts of the world, as they're also looking to learn more about these cross-sector collaborations and technology tools. And the task force is open to all UN agencies, global and local NGOs, private sector companies, academic institutions, entrepreneurs, and host governments. So if you haven't joined the task force yet, please join us today. Here's what we do. We focus on kind of 3 areas of impact: collaborative information exchanges around refugee and IDP education, livelihoods, participation, and protection, basically the webinars that Amy has talked about. Facilitating project-based collaborations and programs, and I'll speak to that in a minute, and then synthesizing these insights into learnings and recommendations and sharing them broadly, both within the community in the region, but also globally. In terms of where we are, what we've done over the past 13 months, so the first phase of engagement, cross-sector engagement, is underway. We're building a cross-sector community through information exchanges, and we've had, since last March, we've had 14 of them. These resources are available to all of you to review and to use and benefit from. They include, their feature collaborative tech-enabled programs by companies like Microsoft, Coursera, HP, Accenture, Udemy, as well as organizations like UNICEF, IRC, NRC, War Child, and more. We've also engaged the private sector in a number of ways, in addition to sharing with us some of the programs and solutions on the webinars. We're working on a first set of cross-sector collaborations, which I'll talk about, and then we've created a private sector engagement guide for the NLG initiative. And this guide really is meant to encourage expanding the possible scope of engagement, private sector engagement, beyond corporate social responsibility and philanthropy. So in addition to CSR, to include also business operations and product development or product adaptation and advocacy and policy. If you, this private sector guide is available to all of you, and we welcome any other use cases and insights you might have. And then lastly, we've been synthesizing all of the learnings and recommendations through our repository on the task force website that is hosted actually by NetHope Solutions Center, publishing newsletters, and then advocating on behalf of NLG at global events as well as the US-based events. Now, here's a snapshot of the calendar of what we've been focusing on for the first half of the year, and I'll speak more about the second half of the year at the end of the presentation. We'll make sure to make these slides available to all of you. So now let me spend a couple of minutes talking about how we're starting to leverage collective impact model, which is something that NetHope is known for, has been doing for the past 17 years. So how we're leveraging this model to address specific problems that conflict-affected youth and adolescents face. So what is the approach? First, we're starting with a problem we need to solve, co-designing then solutions with the humanitarian and private sector and also conflict-affected youth. So Amy talked about having the youth voice integrated into everything we do, and that's exactly how we're also managing these projects. We're using lean startup methodology to act both with urgency and also efficiency. And then we're integrating technology as needed, where it can make difference. And we're measuring, learning, sharing, and iterating with end user feedback, meaning with young people's feedback. So here's some context for what I mean by starting with a problem we want to solve. In September of 2017, NLG Tech Task Force, with the support from Microsoft, brought together private and humanitarian sector stakeholders at the NLG Silicon Valley Symposium here in San Francisco to collaborate on addressing really 4 challenges that conflict-affected youth and adolescents face. They're around education, livelihoods, participation, and representation. It's worth noting that per the guidance from the UN NGO agencies, we focused on Pillar 3. So Pillar 3 is youth and adolescents. And why? These are some of the most urgent needs, impacting not only youth, but also their families, their siblings, and their parents, and their communities. And these are the types of needs that a broader set of private sector companies can help us meet with their resources and expertise. And prior to the symposium, humanitarian organizations and impacted youth researched these 4 challenges and also brought them to life with videos. You're seeing these 4 challenges here, and there is a more detailed document that I believe Frederick is sharing in the chat window. So just to emphasize, understanding these issues was a starting point for envisioning what it would take to really empower these young people to create a better future for themselves, for their families, and also their communities. So with these 4 challenges or opportunities in mind, private sector and humanitarian organizations brainstormed together at the symposium. And from private sector came suggestions of resources and expertise that they have ready or could potentially activate in support of the 4 challenges, so including educational platforms like Pluralsight, communities of educators via Skype in a classroom, creative platforms and initiatives like Adobe Project 1324, Cisco's Networking Academy, and more. And then humanitarian sector participants provided a much deeper context about the needs and situations of the conflict-affected youth, such as digital literacy or lack of connectivity, cultural norms, language, and similar. So then we following the symposium, we formulated these 4 specific projects with several private sector companies, and the first set of projects that you see on the slide include remote mentoring, helping displaced youth learn conversational English. This is being incubated by Salesforce and UNICEF. Training in in-demand skills. This is being incubated by Pluralsight and UNICEF in Lebanon. A learning companion chatbot, which makes discovery and access to learning resources easier. This project is being incubated by the Norwegian Refugee Council and Microsoft, and Adobe Project 1324 Challenge, which is proactively supporting conflict-affected youth across the Middle East and also globally to share their stories through creative self-expression. And Amy, meaning Mercy Corps, as well as Adobe, have been leading on this project. Just the last thing that I'll say on these projects is a bit about the approach, especially for those of you who are interested in participating in the future projects. As mentioned earlier, these are really complex and urgent problems we're trying to address with a diverse set of stakeholders, private sector, humanitarian sector, academic institutions, young people, working oftentimes across 3 or 4 different time zones. So to make that possible, what we realize we need is a collaborative, iterative, and user, meaning youth-centric ways of working together. So these quotes from Microsoft, from NRC, and from Mercy Corps really illustrate how private sector companies, how humanitarian organizations and conflict-affected youth are working together to co-create solutions by applying lean and user-centered design and leveraging technology where appropriate, and really also incubating, as Amy shares in her quote, incubating on behalf of the whole humanitarian community. So in terms of where we are today, the first MVP, minimum viable product, was delivered at the NLG Tech Summit in Amman last month. Its focus on participation, defined without borders, is now available to all youth worldwide, including conflict-affected youth supported by NLG partner agencies. And in the meantime, Amy, so Mercy Corps, and as well as the rest of the NLG and Adobe and now NLG Tech Task Force, we're continuing to gather user feedback and iterate on this experience, because our hope is to have both a broad participation for this specific challenge and then learn and launch new challenges in the future. So, and then other MVPs are on track to be available to a select number of youth this month. So we'll be measuring, we'll be learning, and then iterating with their feedback, while also sharing our learnings broadly. And on this slide, you have access to one of the blog posts that speaks to both the methodology and the learnings to date, and we'll make sure to do that in the future. So, what's next for the task force? Well, as you've heard over the past 10 minutes, in its first year, task force has built a cross-sector community and began work on addressing urgent needs. I do want to note that this wouldn't have been possible without a very close collaboration with the NLG working group leads, UNICEF, World Vision, Mercy Corps, and Save the Children, and also a very generous support from our financial sponsors, Microsoft and TripAdvisor. So thank you to all of you for the partnership on the task force. What's next? We will continue growing the cross-sector community and providing collaborative information exchanges. Please join us in that. We will also work on the current projects and start scaling them as soon as they're ready. And we'll look to initiate new projects. And then lastly, the collective impact wouldn't be effective if we didn't synthesize group insights into learnings and recommendations. So we'll do that and make sure to share them broadly. So, and then lastly, in terms of how you can join us today, you all have the opportunity. You can sign up for the task force to receive future communications and invitations to webinars and events. You can join the Adobe Project 1324 Challenge, Define Without Borders, both as somebody who's appreciating the projects that the young people have submitted, as well as bring your youth to the platform to share their perspectives, their voices. More information will be available through the link that I believe Frederick will share. You can share your resources, and this time we're looking for educational and skills training content for the chatbot library that I mentioned earlier. Contact me if you have any specific learning resources you'd like to share. And then also, lastly, if you would like to provide financial support for NLG specifically, contact Katie, and for the task force, contact my colleague Darren at the email that's provided here. So, hopefully I haven't taken too much of your time. Looking forward to the questions, and then over to Katie and Frederick to take us through the Q&A.
Thank you very much, all of the speakers. Katie, I'll pass it on to you if you want to facilitate the first couple of questions.
Thanks so much, Frederick. What interesting questions. I'll try and sort of respond to a few themes that I see coming up, and then I'll hand over to Mark and Amy. a slight caveat to start with. What we've been presenting to you is really the coalition of organizations and how we're working together at the regional and global level to shout about the needs of adolescents and children and youth, and how we're supporting and strengthening the programming through our regional level work. So we're not at the coalface. In fact, I wonder if some of you who are on the webinar might be closer to the programming and might be able to provide insights to some of these really very specific technical questions. Just a couple more thoughts. I mean, for those of you that are enthused and feel like you'd like to support Next Generation, be part of it, there are many things you can do, you know, without getting involved in the interagency processes that we're running here. I know some of you are on the line are students. We have wonderful student groups that have been initiated in the United States. I think around 50 of them that are all campaigning under the call of No Lost Generation for improvements to refugee rights, to addressing children's needs in conflict, and they are running with that concept and not actually quite as tightly circumscribed as we are here, where we're very clearly defined as responding to the Syria and Iraq crises. So you can start a group in your own organization or in your own community. We have a campaign pack that will support you to do that. And also, whether you do it under a banner or not, I mean, anybody who is using their influence as a citizen to try to put an end to these conflicts, to shout about how important it is to respect the rights of children and young people, you know, that is absolutely the central question that we're facing. There's a sense sometimes that, well, Syria's, you know, the conflict in Syria is coming to an end. It really isn't. It's escalating, and we see horrific violence, and that then places an enormous pressure on the humanitarian community to pick up the pieces, and really the core solution is an end to the conflict. So there's a lot you can do, and we also, you know, are always happy to have collaborations suggested. We have a list of national NGOs that are working in the countries where No Lost Generation is active. If you have a bit of money you'd like to send, if you want to see if there is a virtual volunteering opportunity, there are some organizations that can facilitate that, although it's a little harder. I'll stop there on how to engage, although I'm, you know, very open to people emailing me if you have further questions on that. Just on how do we know about the needs and how do we go about designing the response in education and in the other pillars. Actually, No Lost Generation it simply stands back and lets the normal humanitarian coordination mechanisms do their thing. So there is a big process that happens in August and then finishes in December every year in all humanitarian crises, including these ones, where there is meticulous attention to assessing the needs in all sectors, so education, but also health, shelter, every possible aspect of what's needed in the response, and that's all analysed and sifted and put together in a big appeal on behalf of the whole humanitarian community. So that's how we define the needs under the education pillar and the child protection pillar and the adolescents and youth pillar. And the same for the response. There are experts involved in leading the humanitarian response, and there's a way that this is coordinated through designated lead agencies so that people aren't just using a whole hodgepodge of different approaches, but in fact the needs are cleverly mapped, and the response, you know, is as even across the geographical and population pockets as possible, and also that the approaches are harmonized and they're the most effective as far as we know, and that we keep learning as a humanitarian community. Now, somebody's asked about the funding levels. I mean, this is absolutely at the heart of No Lost Generation. You know, one of our main raison d'etre is just to make sure that the investment is there front and center for adolescents and youth and for children. So the funding rates in 2017 for education were 51% inside Syria and 54% in the refugee hosting countries. That might not sound impressive, but actually the overall figures, the amount of money was really quite impressive. So 128 million inside Syria, that's much more than in many other conflicts around the world, and 451 million in the refugee hosting countries. And probably that doesn't tell the whole story because we just extract that information from funding tracking mechanisms, which, you know, some of them can be slow to be completed, or they don't tell the whole picture. A lot of funding, for example, is multi-sector, so we don't know which sector it went to, but it might have gone to education. So it is quite it's the biggest appeal in the world, the appeal in response to the Syria crisis, and the ambition is much higher. I don't know if that's as a result of knowledge generation. I suspect it has something to do with it. So in other responses, you see kind of, you know, a little bit of ambition around education, but not that real sort of ambition to get every last child in school and to cost that and made the audacious ask that knowledge generation partners made 2 years ago for 1.4 billion. And as a result, we have got quite significant funding for those sectors. It's not enough, and we keep working at it, but it does seem to be distinct from other humanitarian crises that don't have joint advocacy like we have under knowledge generation. I'll hand over to Mark first, if he wants to add anything.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. I think, yeah, I'll just take some of the education questions. There's one here from Julie around tech-based education initiative, meeting the needs of youth and adolescents. There are grants, as mentioned before. There's agencies can sign up for the newsletter, and agencies that are active in the region in at least 3 countries, at least one of the pillars, and attend the working group as an active member. You know, there is opportunities for networking through the agency and through the network and the tech events that we run. But there isn't, knowledge generation doesn't hold grants and isn't a grant making body. It's really an interesting and loose coalition or an initiative where multiple agencies have come together to move this agenda forward. Some of the other education questions around higher education opportunities, collaborations. Again, as mentioned earlier, education, the programming is embedded into response plans. So within the education response plans across the region, there is provision in the appeal and in the actual programmatic work being done by the UN and the INGOs and national NGOs for support for higher education. There's a number of different programs across the region, including scholarships within host countries, including support to universities inside Syria and Iraq, and including scholarships to European and American universities. So there's multiple opportunities for higher education support, and it's a bit difficult to go into too much depth here. We don't have a lot of time. Just wanted to flag that. Roland's asking around increasing access to education and map of needs. In the recap, we'll send a link to the education sector website, which has a lot of data. It's also held on or linked across on the knowledge generation website, which has a list of the or various different knowledge management tools outlining the levels of need, levels of unmet need, the distribution of children in school, out of school, levels of dropout, etc. There's quite a lot of data that's been collected in the education sector. We've been very proactive in this, and that's online and can be found relatively easily. I think Katie answered the question around funding. There's a question from Ahmed around startups and access to data. Again, through the website, through knowledge management, which will be relaunched this coming week, we do host a lot of the data which is shared. Most of it's open source and can be found online on the Whole of Syria website, on Relief Web. All the information that's collected by the UN and major international NGOs that's pulled together, highlighting the needs, highlighting the data. There are data gaps, we do recognize that, and you know, there are opportunities for smaller agencies to engage with knowledge generation and certainly to use all of the information we put up on the website. But as I said, the working group, the membership is restricted, mainly to make it more manageable and more effective. I think that's it for the education questions. Yeah, I don't know if Katie or Amy want to pick up anything else. There was a question around the NLG and community pushing for global focus to resolve the conflict. Amy, did you want to take that one?
The point around advocating for the situation for youth. Yeah, so I think this is a great question. It's, unfortunately, the question says, for kids inside Syria and Yemen, the conflict continues to destroy children in their lives, and goes on to list all of the challenges. And I'll just speak to this as Mercy Corps and then as a co-lead and as a member of NLG. Singularly on our own as agencies, we're never ever going to be able to advocate at the level that we need to be able to change any of the situations that we're working in. And my experience as part of NLG is, leveraging each other's knowledge networks and influence is the only way, with a focus on children, adolescents, and youth, rather than a focus on our agency's priority, whether that's funding or, maintaining programming, whatever that might be, that if and when we do this together in this type of coalition format, we're actually able to get further. We're not as far always as I think we want to be, but for example, at the upcoming Brussels conference, it's a challenging event to influence and to be engaged in, and yet still fighting as a collective to bring youth participants, young people from inside Syria, and young people from the region to the event. While that might seem like a small win, a lot of decisions are made without the voice, experience, emotions of those that are and have experienced the conflict itself, and it matters to bring those stories front and center. So I guess I would say we can do more in our advocacy in our coalitions and in our work together, but I think that's one of the biggest kind of opportunities and influence places that NLG can make a difference. That was my thought on that one. I think we covered kind of everything else. I think there's a lot of questions about small agencies being engaged, and in my experience, I know signing up for a newsletter is something that many of us do all the time, but also, particularly regional organizations, the events are a fabulous opportunity. The NLG EdTech events last year and this year were very powerful and really great connectors of large and small agencies from across to share learnings and approaches. I think that we're at time, so I'll hand it back to the boss.
Katie, any last minute comments? If not, I think we'll close this out. We're at the top of the hour.
No, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining and look forward to engaging going forwards. We'll send a readout from the webinar, which will have a lot of links and enable us to continue talking if we want to.
Fantastic. Well, as the webinar series host, I'm thrilled to have had you talk about this super important issue. Thank you, Katie, Amy, Mark, and Layla. I would encourage everyone to please answer the few questions in the webinar satisfaction poll. I will put that link in the chat window again, and then it's just thanking the audience for a great engagement and hopefully continued engagement beyond this webinar. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, wherever you might be. Take care. Bye-bye.